I wanted to continue the series that we were doing because we'd talked about philanthropy before and like maybe the church should have some philanthropy or how we might do it and all of this. One of the things about philanthropy and the way most people do it, right, is that they don't think about the issues in a big way, that they tend to respond to their feelings and what sort of appears in front of them at this moment, right? They see an ad, they see a person, they see something, and they say, oh, this is where I'm going to give, this is what I should give to, right? Something like that. So this is an effort to back up and think, what are the criteria we should use? Like, how should we think about this problem? And then look around and say, what sort of institutions, what charities, what people, whatever we want to come up with, right, meet those criteria and come to it. This is something that not a lot of people do. Last time, we talked about doing the most good. So that looks out at the world and says there are a whole lot of needs out there. And we can look at all sorts of ways that we fall short to be able to provide the needs for human beings that are suffering from desperate poverty, from animals that don't have homes or shelters to go to, or having their habitat destroyed, to a huge range of needs that are unmet. More than we can satisfy ourselves. Like, there's no way that our contribution is going to take care of it. Problem solved. It's over. So the principle we talked about last time was do the most good. That is, if you're going to donate $10, you should put that $10 to where it's going to satisfy the most needs you could possibly do. And that seems like a sensible sort of humanist principle, right? We're going to take all humans as equal, right? And therefore not preference any one or the other. We're just going to look where our $10 could do the most good, and that's the direction it should go. So I suggested some things that seem to meet that criteria. We talked a bit about Give Directly, that gives cash to poor people, particularly in Africa, but they've actually modified that, and they've done it in the U.S. some as well. And they've shown good results in terms of being able to do the most good, that actually it generates those kinds of good. So it's kind of empirical. We go look and we see how that works. Okay, so that's one framework. The framework I want to talk about today is going to think about the issue a little differently. And it's a framework I think most people find a bit more uncomfortable. I find people tend to push it away and not want to think this way. They happier thinking about needs and themselves as being charitable and satisfying needs, and not thinking about injustice, right, and the claims that injustice places on us. Because injustice, right, creates a stronger sort of claim. If you've taken money from somebody, if you've stolen money from somebody, you have to give it back to them, right? You're required to give it back to them. This is not something that is optional. It's not something that you could choose not to do. It's not something that you can just walk away from. In some ways, it's not even a question of whether you can afford it, right? If it doesn't belong to you, you're supposed to give it back. So that frame of justice is much more demanding than I think we're usually comfortable with when we think about it. But we can think about philanthropy and charity as a matter of righting wrongs or paying debts, right? I'm going to talk about both of those ways of thinking about it. And maybe that is a valuable way to look at what we ought to be doing. We would still need to come up with some principles to talk about how to limit it, but it changes who our priorities are. Okay, so let's think about this. Think about something like righting wrongs. Like, there's an injustice that you've got to take care of. One of the features of justice is most of the time it's sort of individual. You're not responsible for injustice in general. You're responsible for injustice in one way or another you contributed to. Now, it can be corporate in the sense that you're part of a corporate body that committed an injustice, therefore you're obligated to take care of it. It's really abstract. Here's a concrete example. Georgetown University, at a good portion of its history, owned some slaves. This was part and parcel of what the different things that they had. When they came short of money and they needed to get through, they sold off some of those slaves to Louisiana in order to get that money, and it enabled Georgetown University to survive and become the institution that they became today. Now, they are one of the few institutions that have turned around and really faced that injustice. They've looked at it and said it was wrong of them to own those slaves. It was wrong of them to sell those slaves. That isn't something they should have had. And so they've offered to the ancestors of those slaves essentially a free education. They can come to Georgetown for free as a way of righting that wrong. So the claim is not that the descendants of these slaves are the neediest people out there. They may not be. Some of them might be doing very well. They might have things. They may not be the neediest people out there. They didn't look around the whole world to say, what are the issues and where? They said, we did this particular thing wrong, and we need to fix it for those particular people, right? So that's the way this frame is going to make us think. Like, we've got to look at what we have done wrong. Now, notice with Georgetown, it's a corporate responsibility. That is, none of the people at Georgetown now made that decision then, but it's an entity that has continued, right? And so people are responsible in that way. Okay. So if we're going to think about it, right, and what we have to do, we have to think about it from where we sit, right, where we are. It's going to be different for different people, different for different organizations, different for different things people have been part of. This is actually part of the reason I wanted to do that Shreveport history tour with Robert Trudeau, right, is start to get a sense of what has happened here, what kind of injustices have happened here that we might be responsible for, right, that we can't just look the other way. And those might prioritize our giving, right, to say what we need to do with our philanthropy is fix some of those injustices that our city has committed, or our state has committed, or other organizations that we might be part of, right, in those ways. So maybe that's the principle we want to think about. It would be different. I suspect that none of us have any real relationship to the injustices that, say, Australian Aboriginals have suffered. I mean, I'm not associated with any of those, or myself in any of those organizations or those people. There are different people who would be related to that, whereas Native Americans, right, would be a different story for us, right? But different people will see it differently. So this is a little more localized, right? A little more specific in the way that it looks at people and its connections, a little more demanding. And I think people find it a little more emotionally difficult because we really do have to think of ourselves as people who have either participated in injustices or benefited from injustices or something along those lines that make us responsible, right, for trying to fix those injustices. Let me switch frame just a little bit. So injustice is a little bit harsh, and when we're talking about paying our debts, we might want to think about it in another way as well. One of the interesting things, always going to bring up Socrates, we can't get past that, right? We're going to get over to the Crito when Socrates, after he's been convicted and they've sentenced him to death and they're going to bring the hemlock the next day, as often happens with rich people and powerful people and justice systems, his rich and powerful friends had more or less been able to bribe the guard and get everybody available to open the door and let him go. In general, they didn't want to execute him anyway. That wasn't the goal. So they were sort of giving him the opportunity to escape. They weren't going to exonerate him. That's not how it was going to go. They were going to give him the opportunity to escape. And Socrates refuses. He says that would be wrong. That's not what he's going to do. And part of the reason that he gives there is that he has stayed in this community. He has benefited from this community. He accepted their laws, their rules, their ways of governing. Even when he was critical of it, he was part of that community. And so he owed them, right, to sort of follow their rules and follow their procedures. Now, it is a very extreme case to look at it in that way. But we can think of our debts in a similar sort of communal way. We have benefited from schools. We have benefited from police protection. We have benefited from taxes at different points. We have benefited from a number of things in our community. Even when those things aren't great, and people do like to complain, right, and say, oh, this isn't working or that isn't working in one way or another, they're a lot better than they could be, right? You could have a world where these did not exist at all, right, where you didn't have people helping you or connecting to you in one way or another. Nobody raised themselves, right? Nobody raised themselves. So maybe you owe your community for those kinds of debts. If somebody helped make sure that you got educated, your obligation is to help make sure that others get educated, right? To help bring those forward. If you got, student loans when you were going through, right? Maybe you're obligated to support those kinds of opportunities or some sort of program, right, for others that need to be in that way. A sort of reciprocation, right? So it's not that it was unjust. It's that you have benefited, right? And that incurs a debt to reciprocate, a debt to support other people, a debt to help, right, the others that you have benefited from. Now, this would, I think, more straightforwardly fit under what we think of as philanthropy, because we don't have to say that that debt is, legally enforceable or that people can come take it. It's not like that, right? It's that you're kind of self-centered. You're kind of a jerk if you're not willing to pay back, right, the people who helped you out along the way. So both of those might give us frameworks for thinking about philanthropy. Both of those frameworks would focus us a little more locally, right? Where we're not looking around the entire world at the poorest people to say, okay, this is where we can help. We would be looking around more closely to people that we have some sort of relationship with, some sort of history with. Either they helped us, right, and they benefited us and they contributed, and therefore we need to contribute back and make a community out of that. Or maybe we've wronged them, or institutions we've been part of have wronged them, and we need to make it right by repairing in that way. So it's a little more communal, it's a little more local in its focus. In some ways, it's more demanding as well in what it asks of you. So anyway, I want us to take an opportunity to discuss this principle and think about the others, and think a little bit about what we might want to do with philanthropy.